Darling, we've had one hell of a time, but the question on everybody's mind, where is the bottom?
Hello and welcome to Ideas Don't Bleed, a comics podcast presented by Ashcan Press and featuring Matthew Rosenberg and the Supple Boiz, Ethan S. Parker, and Griffin Sheridan. This is part 2 of our discussion with Joshua Williamson. We hope you enjoy.
Shifting gears a little, you also have a new book out on shelves in stores, which is the wonderful Dark Ride. And we don't have too much time left, but I wanted to talk about that a little because I really like the book, and I sort of wanted to hear... first of all, I guess you should just explain what Dark Ride is.
So Dark Ride is what if Walt Disney sold his soul to the devil to make Disneyland? That's essentially the high pitch of it. Don't tell anybody that's really what it's really about. I don't want to get sued. It's a place for me to do a story about my obsession with amusement parks, and then time that put that with horror. But like the first issue is about this kid who he loves horror. He loves this amusement park. It's called Devil Land, and he goes there to the amusement park. And while he's there, he starts to uncover that there's fucked up stuff, and there's some twists and turns. And we have the family that runs the park, and there's very much like a lot of tension and conflict between the family on who's actually going to run the park. I have this brother and sister named Sam and Halloween, and they're competing with each other to who's going to get control of the park eventually if their father ever dies. But what they don't know is their dad made this deal with the devil, and all these like fucked up things happen because of that deal. That's what it's about. But it's really just a place for me to mess around with my obsession with amusement parks. My
next question was going to be, in some ways, this seems like it hits like a lot of your interests very deeply, and like horror and amusement parks. Well, we don't have to talk about that.
It does though. I'm obsessed with it. We've talked about this.
Yeah,
like
I
think about amusement parks every single day.
I know. The thing that struck me reading it, I was like, man, I always have this thing when people show art in other art, when like in a story, like someone has to read a poem, and you're always like, you watch a movie where someone has to read a poem they wrote, and you're like, that poem kind of sucked, and everyone's crying, or like
stand-up comedy.
Yeah, stand-up comedy. You're like, you're not funny, and then like the band writes the song, and I always think about like, the one that always sticks out to me is like the opera in The Fifth Element, where I'm like, I don't even know if I'm supposed to think that was good. Like, I don't actually know what I'm supposed to feel about that, like whether that's making fun of this. But I always think about like how hard it is to show art in art and be like, this art matters. But reading Dark Ride, I was like, and it's a little different, but like, I was like, man, it seems like a really fucking fun amusement park. Like, it seems like really cool, like in a way that like, I love Disney World and all that stuff. And like, but there's so much stuff that's like not for me. Like, I don't care about the teacups or riding on Dumbo or whatever. Excuse me. The ghost of Dumbo just choked me to death. Is he dead?
But you are fucking... You're all in on the character dinner, though.
Well, it's oh man, I've been to a character breakfast before. I've been to a few of them, but anyway, my wife hates those character breakfasts. We went to one time, and she doesn't like anyone in mascots. Like, she thinks mascots are terrifying. Like, one time, she told me this story. I forget what the whole context of it was, but like, she was at her mom's house, and she went outside, and there was like a mascot. It wasn't even near Halloween. There was somebody dressed in a mascot costume just walking down the middle of the street. And I think that like traumatized her. So whenever she sees mascot, this is why in the book, it's this idea that the mascots are also part of the scary thing. Yeah, because of that. We went to one time, and it was like the fancy one with the princesses. And it was like my wife and I and my daughter, it was her third birthday. But then we also had like 2 of my best friends, the 2 artists I talked about. And it was insanely expensive. Like, holy shit, this is expensive. And I barely ate because this was like little dainty, like princess food. And I also, I don't eat red meat or anything. So it's like, if everything was like bacon and sausage for some reason, it was like a weird thing where I'm like, I can't even eat any of this. Can I just have a pancake? But that experience was really interesting, like being a kind of a ghost in the room, because it's like, you have this booth where it's like 3 adult men and then it's like on the other side is my wife and my daughter, and then it's a million princesses, and then but also like a ton of little girls. We were like, they obviously did not care about us. Like we were intangible, you know, they were very focused, but it was fun watching them. And those women are awesome. Like their like acting ability to be those princesses, like holy shit. Sometimes you're like, yo, they sound exactly like the cartoon. Like it is crazy in some places, but my wife had a blast. So, and my wife and my daughter had a really good time. We were just kind of like, we should not be here.
Do you ever talk to Scott Snyder about this stuff?
Yeah, dude. Because so after I wrote issue 1, actually issue 1, I think issue 1 was already drawn, and I was gonna go in and do like my lettering draft. I called Scott and I was like, I need you to tell me all about your first day. I need you to tell me about
Scott worked at Disney World.
He worked at Disney World. He was Buzz Lightyear. So, but that was
I recently found out about this, and I was floored by that. Dude, I couldn't believe it.
It was his rebellious stage. His rebellious stage was to work at Disney World. That's true. I'm not making that up. I'm not making a joke. He'll tell you.
I know. I just like the idea of phrasing your time at Disney World as rebellious.
Well, so so I called and asked him, and I was like, how did it go? And he was like, well, he worked in trash first, and then he worked his way up, and then he got the job being Buzz Lightyear and the whole process. So that's why in issue 1, the guy is like, oh, I want to move up, and he recognizes that moving up is becoming a mascot. That all came from talking to Scott about it. I have never worked at an amusement park before. No, I never. And what's interesting about Disney is I know that at Disney you can work your way up from being like sanitation to being like an executive. That is a real thing that can happen in the park, and you know. But anyway, yeah. What do you want to talk about? You want to talk about how crazy I am, how much work I put into the map and stuff? What do you want to know?
Dude, I was gonna talk about the map. I could only read issue 1 this afternoon, but I got to the end of it and I was like, son of a bitch, that's so good. And there's so many things on there too. How long did it take you to put that together?
I had all the names a long time ago, like all the names and stuff. Like once I knew, I was obsessed. A lot of times the books that I end up working on are like, I'm obsessed with this thing over here and then this thing over here. And at some point they merge. That's almost all the books I do have kind of come together. It's like they were 2 books at one point and they became 1. And so with this one, I'd always been obsessed with doing something with an amusement park. And then I had this idea for some horror stuff with the double. And then all of a sudden one day I was eating breakfast on a Saturday morning. And then I'm like, oh, this is the same idea. And then I ran to my office and I wrote the first 11 pages. So like maybe 4 years ago, I wrote the first 11 pages, and those pages never changed. I just knew it. You know, I was like, boom, this is how it is. Where it's like the opening sequence with the guy who the park, and then that 2-page spread of like, and then here's the park, like going from black and white to color, like a very Walt Disney kind of thing. That was all from that. Like one morning, I figured it out. And so I had a notebook that was just dedicated to that book. And so I would just write down ideas for the rides first. And so I had all the rides first and all the different ideas for it. And again, because I'm already like obsessed with amusement parks, like I could probably draw you a map of Disneyland without looking, and I could probably for Disneyland, you know? And so I just know it really well. And same thing with like, Knott's Berry Farm and then Universal. Like if it's a California park, like I've probably been there many times. I know it pretty well. So I started just writing stuff down of different ideas of what the park would be. The challenge came in that Andre, the artist, he has never been in an amusement park in his life. So I had to like gather as many videos and references to send him, and he nailed it. You know, I think the overall like vibe of it when they're walking around, the stuff in the background, like he really got it. So I sent him a ton of stuff. Yeah, one of the rides I sent him to really get him to understand, because one thing I wanted him to understand was that when you go on a ride, you don't just like walk up on it. Disney and most amusement parks, there's a whole experience before you get on the ride. So I sent him like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride as sort of like a reference. Yeah. Oh, it's awesome. I sent him that as a reference. It's too bad you don't have it in Florida anymore. So they, you know, yeah, they. Well, that's your park. So I mean,
no, I know it is. That's where I went as a kid.
Yeah, so I used them as a reference for kind of a lot of it. Like this is, you know, how it is, like the line and stuff. And then obviously I sent him videos for like Indiana Jones to be like, hey, it's like a whole thing to get to the ride. But
What I like is that you made an entire theme park of really disturbing rides, and probably none of them are as traumatizing for a child as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is in reality. Where you get murdered by a train and go to hell.
So my daughter who's 6, the other day so my son, this is how obsessed I am with amusement parks. My son, sometimes during the day, he'll see me and he'll come up to me and he'll go, "You want to watch rides?" He's only 2. Like, "You want to watch rides?" And I'm like, "Yeah, let's go do it." So we'll go in the living room and I'll put on like a walkthrough of a ride, right? So they know about a lot of these rides. My daughter's been on a few, but he's never left Oregon before, so he hasn't, heavy reference. But every once in a while, he'll be like, "I want to watch the Cars ride." So we'll watch, the Radiator Springs Racers ride at, Cars Land and stuff. And so we'll watch those. The other day, I was like, "Oh, let's watch Mr. Toad's Wild Ride." And so we watched Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. When we got to that part, my daughter was like, "What is this?
Yeah.
Where is this?" And I had to be like, "Well, honey, this is hell." Like,
Jesus.
and, yeah, it was an interesting conversation. I think my wife wasn't around. But I had to be like, "So this is what hell is." And had to explain to her like a little bit of hell without going too deep into it. But it was pretty fun. I'm gonna plug something here, not mine.
Yeah, please.
How obsessed I am with amusement parks. I actually have. You guys have probably seen this. I have like Magic Candle Company. Do you know what this is? It's like they make candles that smell like the ride. So like this one is haunted and it smells like Haunted Mansion.
Yeah.
This one is called Pirate Life. Matt, you can probably guess what that smells like.
That's awesome.
This one is
for the
called,
ride.
Yeah, this
smells like
called, This is Terror, which is like the Hollywood Tower of Terror. This one is called Horror Nights, and it's supposed to smell like Not Scary Farm. Which I can. What's crazy is I'll tell you this. This does not smell like Not Scary Farm, but that's how many times I went that I can tell you. Like I could be like, that's not what it smells like.
In my
Are any of them accurate? Are any of them true to?
Some smell right, but this one, like, because not Scary Farm smells like the smell of like very pumped in like fog, because they pump in so much fog. That's really what you're smelling. This doesn't smell like that.
In my experience, a lot of the rides would smell like popcorn and barf, like little kid barf.
What amusement parks are you going to?
I can't say that, I'll get sued, but the same things are sued. A lot of kids barf. Let's not lie. A lot of kids barf. I've
only seen one person barf one time in an amusement park, and it was at Disneyland Paris, and it was on the original Star Tours because they still have it. They don't have the new one. They have
Star Tours. It's not even that.
Yeah,
intense.
they have the original one. Yeah, they have the original one. Someone threw up on it. And it took us 15 minutes to find somebody who worked for Disneyland to be like, "Yo, someone just threw up on this ride." Like we couldn't find anybody. We were off season. It was a weird thing. Anyway.
I actually, my love as an adult for theme parks came from watching a kid barf. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but I was online I was there as an adult, and I was online and was kind of like, "Am I too old for this?" and whatever. And then this kid barfed, and it was, his parents were upset. And like immediately someone from Disney World comes out and like takes the parents and the kid away, and they're like, "Are you okay?" And they take him off to go do something. And then a guy comes by and very discreetly puts sawdust down on it. And then a guy comes by from a different direction and like sweeps it up. And then another guy comes with this scented water in a backpack and sprays it. And the whole thing was like a minute and a half. And like a minute and a half later, like the sick kid is gone, the smell is gone, the experience is gone, the road is cleaner than it was before, and no one talked to each other, no one did anything. And I was like, this is such a like, nowhere on earth is there this much commitment to like creating an illusion for you. Like the level of just like brutal efficiency to create an illusion. I was like, yeah, just as like the craft of that was really impressive to me, and sort of staggering and a little terrifying in a fun way.
But that's
Disney's whole. That's the full slogan of Disney World. Is it's the most magical brackets and efficient place on earth.
Yeah, it's a beautiful machine. Like I love it. Like I put this in the back of the book of issue 1 of like, I want people to understand that this book is not about me trying to mock these places, because I find that machine to be fascinating. It's like I heard this story one time. Matt, that was very similar. It was like this family. They had gotten a room at Disneyland, and there were 2 beds, and the other bed was supposed to be a kid's bed, and they didn't have one. So they're like, whatever, with the kid in the bed, no big deal. And then in the middle of the night, the kid rolled out of the bed, hit their head on the nightstand, right? So it's bleeding, and they called down, and they had, somebody come up immediately, and they were like, and this is like the middle of the night, you're talking like 2 or 3 in the morning, and they brought so they came up, and they were able to like have a EMT take care of the kid, and then they were like, hey, let's go take you into the park. So they literally took this mom and dad and their daughter, and they took them into one of the shops. They like turned the shop on. They're like, you can pick out one thing, it's yours. And so she went, she got a stuffed animal. They're all happy, and then they get back to the room, and they're like, all right, have a good night. And they walk in their room, and the room is totally different. It was the same room, but they had taken that bed out. They took the nightstand out. They had cleaned everything, and they put a new bed in, a new nightstand in, but they put the correct bed in, and they did that. And it was like, so at one point you're like, what a touching story. They took them in to get a toy, but then they like, that's some shit, like completely changing the room out while they're gone. And it's like, that stuff I find fascinating. And like sure. They control the smells, they control all that kind of stuff. If anything ever goes wrong, somebody's there like that. I find that stuff to be really interesting and fascinating. I mean, we, with Marvel, like, I think the fact that like the day the Marvel shows premiere, so it's like the day that Moon Knight premiered on Disney Plus, they had Moon Knight standing on top of the buildings in like Avengers Campus, right? And like running along the buildings. So like that day. And then when She-Hulk, I remember thinking about this because I heard about this a couple of times. So like when, I think when Multiverse of Madness came out, they would have like Scarlet Witch walking around in that costume like that day. Like they time it, When the She-Hulk show started, I was like, oh, what are they going to do? Is there going to be someone dressed up as She-Hulk, like walking around? And what they did was they had park benches with the She-Hulk for hire signs on them the day it premiered. That kind of coordination. I know it sounds like, oh, that's easy, but it's like, yo, someone thought of that and they're executing it. And that's the part that gets difficult sometimes, is like having a company that big with that many people where they're still able to execute things precise like that. Sure. That's the stuff that I find really interesting. And I put a lot of that into the book and try to find ways to still make it scary and still play with those tropes to be scary. Like when I was a kid, I was always afraid of somebody getting their hands cut off on Space Mountain. Like I was always like, do not. And there's a sign right before you make that right turn that's like, keep your hands in. To me, that didn't mean just do this. Like, obviously you shouldn't be doing this, but that meant this too, right? Like, don't put your hands up. So you're on Space Mountain and people are like putting their hands up and you're like, they're going to lose their hands. Any minute I'm going to be covered in blood. Like they're going to get their hands cut off and there's going to be blood all over me. And obviously that doesn't happen. But
I've only done Space Mountain once, and I was old enough that I understood logically that I wasn't going to be decapitated, but fully thought I was going to be, like, my brain was like, you're not going to be decapitated, but my body was like, but we probably are going to be decapitated. And that you have that scene in issue 2 where they're like, oh, a guy decapitated on the ride, and I was like, yep, there it is. Like, that's what I live thinking about. Was I don't think about Space Mountain that much, but when I do, I think about my own death.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree.
I do think about stuff a lot. So I put all that in the book, and then it's also about, the book is also a little bit about being a workaholic and the idea of like how much you're willing to give up for your, I say passion, but for basically work, right? Because it's like the dad, Arthur, the fact that he was willing to sacrifice people to get this thing he wanted. Like he wanted to build scary rides, build a scary amusement park, and then you have his son who is a workaholic and is also trying to like prove something to himself, but also prove something to his father. And it's the same idea for him now, where it's like, well, how much is he willing to give up, of himself, of his humanity, of his life for this thing, right? For basically work. So, on multiple levels, it's about, me having fun with the amusement park, but it's also me talking about my own issues of being a workaholic,
I was sort of curious about that because there are like 3 sort of distinct story threads in the book. There's, the dad and what the park is, and then there's the sibling rivalry of the 2 kids who are, the heir apparents to inheriting the park. And then you have this other story of the kid who comes to work there and where that goes. And I'm sort of wondering, like, it's all crafted together so well that it flows seamlessly, and it's really impressive, like, writing trick. But I'm kind of wondering, like, what was the story? I mean, you touched on this a little before, but like, what was the story that brought you in? It was the dad selling his soul for the park, or did you want to do the sibling rivalry story, or like going to this as a kid? Like, which one of those is your sort of into the story?
I mean, they're all a little bit of me, I guess. Like, I feel like all those are they're all a little bit of me, but I would say the idea of it started off with the dad, because part of it was, I love horror comics, but there was a moment where I was kind of struggling with the idea of like, okay, what's a horror comic now, right? And obviously we have a lot of friends that do a lot of horror comics, and there are a lot of horror comics out there. And so I was like, I gotta do something different. What does that even look like now, right? And I was putting myself in the shoes of Arthur at one point of like, oh, well, if Arthur's already done these bad things and now he's struggling, I kind of felt a disconnect there at some point, and that's where the idea of Sam came in. So I think it went like, first it was Arthur, then it was the kids, and then it was Owen, right? It was like, I want to introduce a character that is actually enthusiastic about this place and is having a good time. Because like the siblings are kind of jaded. Like they love it, but they love it for different reasons. They love the power of it. They like that they're celebrities, that they're like the prince and princess of Devilland. Like they like that aspect of it. But I wanted somebody who was just like, I'm here to have fun, and that was the Owen character, the kid that just kind of likes the park and loves horror. And but yeah, it started off with Arthur, like Arthur being the one that was like, he would do anything to get this thing he wanted, right? Like he wanted to prove to everybody that he could make a scary ride, and that was what people really wanted. That was the initial ideas all came around him, and then it slowly started bridging down from there.
Along the same lines, like you have a lot of sort of, I mean, it's a horror book, but it's also this book about family. It's all these other things, and but there's all this sort of social commentary in it. You're sort of commenting on like the commercialization of our entertainment. You're commenting on like just sort of corporate America, and like, you have the YouTube stuff is in there, and you sort of touch on this, like, the social commentary that I think is really interesting. So you're not going into the stuff not critically, but also like it sort of bumps up against satire in places where it's like you're sort of like, is this absurdist or is it not? Is this satirical or is it not? And I wonder like how much of doing a book like this, like you're trying to scare people, but also like you're kind of making fun of some of this stuff and like in a loving way and satirizing some of it. And like how much do you want people laughing? How much do you want people scared? And like, how do you find that balance?
That's been one of the hardest parts of it. Like you said, a lot of it's with love. Like it just feels, all the satire stuff is mostly me just having fun. Like that's really what it comes down to. And I think that stuff's real, and that YouTube thing is real. Like there are people, like right now, there's a guy on YouTube who goes to Disneyland every night, and all he does is walk around and record like the fireworks and Fantasmic. So, and he streams it. He streams it every single night. So I know at 9:00, if I just want to like see what's going on at Disneyland, I know where to go, and I can just watch this dude walk around the park. And I know there are people that record. There was a time during the pandemic, like I think at the end of the pandemic, there was a guy who was going to the park multiple times a week, maybe not every day, but he'd go to the park multiple times, and he would just record the progress they were making. And one of the big things was he would talk about the parking structure. Like they were building a new parking structure. So he would just record the progress of the parking structure like multiple times a week. And it was like, in some ways, my wife and I would be kind of like, man, it's so crazy. This guy's just recording this. And it was like, yo, we're watching it. We're watching it all the time, So like we're very up to date on the parking structures at Disneyland. With the humor stuff, I feel like that actually goes all the way back to like me and how much my origins of like liking horror, right? Like all the stuff that I really liked when I was younger were all like a little funny, like very Sam Raimi. You look at like Evil Dead, you look at Freddy, Army of Darkness, like a lot of the stuff that I sort of like really started getting into horror, there was always like a little bit of tongue-in-cheekness to it, there was always like a little bit of humor. And I think that's really what, like, I didn't see Texas Chainsaw Massacre till much later. And yeah, the movie's hilarious, but I didn't see that till much later. But it's like when I was watching stuff like, again, like Evil Dead and Army of Darkness, and you watch those Freddy movies where it's like, because that, Nightmare on Elm Street is a really scary movie. It's a really well done scary movie, but it's still kind of funny in places, it's still like cool. And so that's where the very first, my first like really early experiences with horror were actually through Disney, because Disney had this VHS tape. I actually just found it the other day. It's still the original one that I had when I was a kid. They had this collection. It was a VHS tape, and it was a collection of like little kind of horror stories they had done. but it was also like snippets of other movies, right? So it's like Maleficent turning into the dragon. So it's just that sequence, right? And fighting the prince. Not the whole movie, it's just that part. Then it was like, it was like Mr. Toad going to hell, or it was like a little bit of Sleepy Hollow. It's not all Sleepy Hollow, but a little bit of Sleepy Hollow. And it was all narrated by the Magic Mirror. And so much of my like storytelling stuff actually comes out of this, because in that he even talks about like, a hero is only as good as their villain. That was the first place I ever heard that. So really as an early age, like a lot of my influences of horror are tied to Disney from very early. But also that's like a little humor, because all of a sudden they'd have like, here is this Donald Duck short, with them fighting, not fighting, but there's like a witch and Donald Duck, and the boys are working with a witch to get candy, or like Lonesome Ghosts. Lonesome Ghosts is a very early Disney cartoon. That's basically Ghostbusters. It's pretty much, it's Mickey, Donald, and Goofy, and they have an ad in the paper where they fight ghosts, and people call them, and they come and they fight ghosts. So you kind of tie all this together, right? So it's like the Disney of it all, the horror of it all, and also the humor. Like I've always there's a line in there I think I have where it's like, it's like horror and I said horror and sex are kissing cousins. That's what it was. But it's not just that. It's like, I think that like horror and comedy always sort of go together. Sure. And sometimes like obviously I'll watch something like Midsummer and I'm like, this movie is not funny at all. And but I mean it's a little funny.
I think it's funny in places.
It's a little funny. It's a little funny when you start getting into it, you start thinking about it, like, I bet I would laugh. Or like when I saw Barbarian, Barbarian is a great horror movie. Definitely like a little funny,
Sure.
100%.
And so I always think that like when you're doing horror and humor at the same time, and it's actually like even with the editors of Skybound, there are times where I have to like remind them of that. They're like, well, this part might be a little too, I don't know, people might laugh at this part when they're supposed to be scared. And I'm like, the fact that we don't know is the correct answer. Like some people might be scared and some people might laugh, and I'm like, that's what I want,
Definitely.
Yeah, when I was a kid, there's this movie. It's called Nothing But Trouble. Have you guys ever seen this movie before? Yeah. It's considered like one of the worst movies ever made. I watched. There's this guy on YouTube. It's called Praise of Shadows, I think, and he does these great like long documentaries about different movies, different pop culture stuff. And he did one a month ago about Nothing But Trouble, and he goes into this whole thing about how hated it was and how much everyone thought it was this awful, awful movie. And then like 15 minutes in, he goes, but this is one of my favorite movies of all time. And he talks about, this video was awesome. It's like 40 minutes long. At the ending, he talks about how much it really is like a satire that people didn't get. It goes out of his head.
Sure. It's definitely a much weirder film than I think people just think it's like a failure, but it's definitely doing a lot of really strange stuff. And Dan Aykroyd is terrifying in it. Yeah.
You have a Dark Crisis finale coming out. Probably by the time this episode is out, it will be done. You will have finished it.
I mean, I'm done. Well, technically, I'm done.
You're already done, but the book will be out and in readers' hands, and we'll have experienced it.
This episode will be out sometime mid 2025. So
you'll be wrapping up on Superman by the time. Superman run. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about amusement parks with us for a long time, and your excellent book Dark Ride and your awesome stuff on Substack and all the stuff we didn't get to. I wrote a lot of questions. I'll just email them to you and we can discuss them later off air.
We'll do a part 3 and 4.
Drop them in the chat and I'll just answer them.
But no, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Josh.
It's always good to talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, this was really fun.
Of course. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our discussion with Joshua Williamson. Make sure to check out Dark Ride as well as everything else Josh is working on by visiting his Substack, Joshua Williamson's Super Scary Newsletter, at joshuawilliamson.substack.com. To get the latest episodes of this podcast, as well as news, giveaways, and even comics delivered straight to your inbox, go to ashcanpress.com and sign up for the newsletter. We'll be back next week for part 2 of our discussion, and in the meantime, you can write to us at ideasdon'tbleedpod@gmail.com, or tweet to Matthew Rosenberg at Ashcan Press on Twitter, me at Tales to Astonish, or Griffin at Griff Sheridan. We'll include some of your correspondence on the show, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. And big thanks to Summer People for our theme song, Where's the Poison? Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Where is the poison?